So we're going to continue on with our series on the U.S. military. We're going to be diving deep undersea into the U.S. Navy with Admiral Ben Wachendorf. Welcome, Ben.
Yes, welcome. Hey, thank you, AJ. Good to see everybody here. I'll try to keep this brief. I don't have any prepared slides to show you, and I'd like to leave a few minutes for Q&A at the end. Shouldn't take the 15 to 20 minutes max. I was in the Navy for 38 years. I retired as a two-star flag officer, and I was CO of the most highly decorated ship in 230 years history of the United States Navy. Other than that, as AJ alluded, I was specializing in submarines for the first half of my career and did pretty much joint duty assignments for the second half. The mission of the Navy is to recognize that the United States is a maritime nation and requires the Navy to protect America at sea, alongside with allies and its partners to defend freedom, preserve economic prosperity, and keep the seas open and free. That's a pretty much pablum kind of thing, but it hasn't changed much over the years. What has changed is technology, and the Navy is the sea service arm that supports our national defense strategy. Currently, the budget of the Navy is combined with the Marine Corps, which is in the Department of the Navy, together $200 billion, which is about 1/3 of the DoD budget. And as I'll get to later, that's an issue. It's traditionally been split equally amongst the services, but there's arguments for changing that. And I'll get into that in just a minute. 161 billion of that is for the United States Navy, and 40 billion of that is for the United States Marine Corps. The Navy has 290 deployable ships today. In law passed by Congress, mostly as a political gesture, the Navy has been instructed to achieve a force level of 355 ships. That number has changed a lot, and it's not likely the Navy is going to be able to achieve that goal with current budget expectations. The new administration under President Biden has expressed a goal of 321 to 372 manned ships, but also 77 to 140 unmanned ships. And get into that. This unmanned thing is not unique to the Navy. Unmanned platforms in the military are a growth industry for good reasons. The fact that I think is relevant, though, and I know we all pay taxes, is that if you add up the tonnage of the United States Navy, it's not only the biggest Navy in the world, it's bigger than the next 13 navies combined, many of which are our allies. So, as you walk the halls of the Pentagon, people in the Army and the Air Force say, what's all this talk about throwing more money at the Navy? We don't need to do that. And we could talk the rest of the afternoon about that, but I'll let it go. The Navy has 347,000 active duty military personnel. It also has 280,000 civilians and 100,000 in the reserves. Two comments here. They're just facts. I'll get to opinions later. I'll try to make sure I identify what are my opinions and what are facts. But it's a fact that the cost of people is going up. We're in a war for talent. You see it every day in the press. It's not unique to the military. The cost of caring for these people, particularly healthcare costs, are going up. And so one of the motivations, in my opinion, for going to unmanned forces is to reduce those personnel costs. And that is significant. Another fact is that on average, a US Navy ship, if you add up all the cost of that ship over its lifetime, 30% of that cost is what it costs to buy it. 70% of the cost is what it costs to operate it, man it, train the crews, pay their salaries, fuel. In a nuclear powered ship, that ratio is 60-40 because when you buy the ship, it comes with a big tank of gas. But that is very significant because as we speak today, just last week, the Senate Armed Services Committee, in reviewing the upcoming budget, in a very, very rare example of bipartisanship, voted 29-1 to increase the defense budget by $25 billion. And in the Navy, they wanted an extra destroyer and more 35C, which is the Navy type of Joint Strike Fighter. Well, that's all well and good, but they didn't include any money to operate those. And Congress has a long history of doing this because they're interested in jobs at Lockheed Martin or Bath Iron Works or wherever it is. And it's not unique to the Navy. But all the services, and I'd say this as a fact because it's been researched and pretty well documented, have more force structure than they can afford to maintain. And we see this, particularly in the Navy and the Air Force, in reduced readiness rates. The number of aircraft that are mission capable has sometimes been below 50%. And it's not unique to the United States Navy. I was commenting to AJ and Jock on another piece of our business and noted that the first Sea Lord, who's like the senior Royal Navy executive, said that only one of their 6 destroyers could get underway. The other 5 were, even if they had to, couldn't get underway. So we get into a discussion of what should the force mix be and how big does the force need to be. Today, the Navy has 11 aircraft carriers. The Joint Chiefs of Staff have recommended repeatedly reducing that, not just because of the cost of the aircraft carriers, but the cost of the planes that go on those aircraft carriers. In a political point of debate, Vice President Pence reversed a budget decision to eliminate one about a year ago, and we'll see where we go from here. The Navy today has 14 strategic missile submarines. They're starting a new class because these ships are running out of life, and that will be going to 12 if the Columbia class is fully funded. That's very expensive, though, well over $100 billion. The Navy today has 50 attack submarines. They're all nuclear, and they have a force goal of 66. So that's a growth industry, one of the few in the Department of Defense. The Navy today has 104 large surface combatants, cruisers and destroyers, mostly destroyers. The Navy trying to get rid of its cruisers, and they're going to 38, or they have 38 frigates and littoral combatant ships. The rest are in logistics. Those numbers are under review. An interesting one that affects SMA number of force level is in the amphibious ship area. Traditionally, the Navy has been required to maintain enough amphibious ships to lift 2 Marine Expeditionary Brigades. And recently, the Commandant of the Marine Corps has agreed that that's too many ships. We can't afford them. That needs to be reduced. And they're advocating starting a much smaller program of light amphibious warships that could number up to 35 or 38, but reducing the number of large decks down by maybe as many as 10. So those are just facts and figures. I'd like to get into a few of the issues. I'll finish with a couple of sea stories and then open it up for questions. The many issues in the Navy. I mentioned the excessive force structure that they can't afford to maintain. That's a challenge. There is also a congressional pushback in that the Navy, and I would agree with Congress in this, and it's bipartisan, it has been criticized for leaping ahead too far in technology. The biggest example of that was the littoral combatant ship. And another example is the USS Ford, the newest class of aircraft carrier, which actually uses, amongst other things, electromagnetics to launch aircraft. Take very heavy planes and push them over 150 miles an hour in 2 seconds with magnetics. and there's been some challenges there in implementing those technologies. So the Navy's vision of the future is to rely, particularly in the surface force, a lot on unmanned surface vehicles, partly because of the personnel costs I referred to earlier, and also to distribute the force so they don't have large targets like aircraft carriers that could be easily detected and attacked by long-range missiles from high-end adversaries, particularly China. Congress has been pushing back against the Navy for these unmanned things, saying you need to study more how they're going to operate for months at a time without any human intervention. And the Navy has responded to that by setting up propulsion drivetrains in Philadelphia and running them for 100 days, that kind of thing. So that's one issue. I guess one of the issues that the Navy's always had has been it's a tribal force. By that, I mean there's really three navies within the Navy. There's the Air Navy, the Surface Navy, and the Submarine Navy. And with the exception of enlisted boot camp and Naval Academy type officer training, we never trained together. All after you finish those programs, you're stovepiped in all your training and culture and operations, and that makes for challenges because the way the Navy fights is not in a stovepipe, but not only with other tribes within the Navy, but they also fight with the Air Force and the Army, and that brings into joint warfare conflicts, or friction points. It's just a challenge that has to be overcome, in my view. Now, I'm coming up on the end of my assigned time. I guess I could tell a couple of sea stories. The one that seems to make people smile the most, that dates myself, but you notice this gray hair is not indicative of being a young kind of feller. Back in 1975, I was an ensign on USS Keynote in the Mediterranean, and it was Trafalgar Day, and we were tied up alongside HMS Ark Royal. That was a British aircraft carrier. On board was a British lieutenant, as they called them, named Prince Charles. He was a helicopter pilot. And Trafalgar Day in the Royal Navy is a very important holiday. Well, it's for the whole country, it's important. It's the anniversary of Nelson's victory over the Armada. But I diverge just a little bit. It's interesting to note here that there's a Royal Navy, a Royal Marines, and a Royal Air Force, but there's no Royal Army. And the British have a polite way of explaining why that is, because of the construction and units of the Army structure. But the real answer is because the British Army rebelled against the Crown in support of Cromwell in the English Civil War at the end of the 1500s. So there will never be a Royal Army. Anyway, but there's a Royal Navy, and the Crown, out of its fondness for the Royal Navy, has a law that I believe is still in valid today, that any time on any Royal Navy ship, a bottle of spirit is opened and a toast is drunk to the Crown will pay the cost of that bottle of spirit. And we were the only foreigners around, so we were very popular on Trafalgar Day, and were invited over to a nice dinner in the wardroom of the Ark Royal, which is huge. And they had the biggest rug, probably out of the colonial days, Indian, I don't know. I've never seen a rug that was so big. And at the end of the dinner, which included wine, which we don't allow on any of our ships, they cleared all the tables and chairs away, and the Commodore, the senior officer present, said, "Well, it's time for games. I think we should do Fox and Hounds." And he asked the captain, who is the junior officer in his wardroom? Well, that was me. And so I was allowed to take off my service dress blue blouse, and I still had a shirt and tie and long pants on, and crawl under the carpet. Prince Charles was blindfolded and given a broom, And because his helicopter was what we call an ASW, an anti-submarine warfare helicopter, he would blindfolded and say ping, and I had to say echo. First couple times, I guess I didn't say it loud enough, so I got kicked until I said loud enough so they could hear it through the carpet or rug. And he would bat the floor trying to find me, and I had to move as fast as I could, which is not easy to do under a carpet, go around behind him and knock him over. Meanwhile, everybody else is around the perimeter drinking port and making fun of us. Well, he never got me, I never got him, but I came out bathed in sweat. And just an anecdote to that story was I was the Defense Attaché in Moscow, and it was 2005 when the British Defense Attaché was going home to the UK for the Queen's birthday. She actually has more than one, but that's another story. And I said, well, you're any chance you'd be meeting Prince Charles there? He said, yeah, well, the whole royal family will be there. I said, well, why don't you tell him that story and see if he remembers that? And so he did. And he came back and he said, oh, the prince said he remembers that fondly and passes on his warmest regards. Like Bill Murray in the Caddyshack movie, after he tells the Dalai Lama story with a pitchfork in his hand, I got that going for me. I'm about out of time here. There's other sea stories, but maybe we could just open this up for any questions.
Yeah.
There's no such thing as a dumb question.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you, Ben. Please put the questions in the chat. In the meantime, I would like to share for everyone a story about an experience which I personally got to share it with Ben.
Can we have Ben brought back up with us?
Yeah, Ben, can you go back on, please? It'd be great. Thanks. So, Ben, you might recall a number of years ago, the two of us had a chance to visit the senior leadership at the Post-Naval Graduate School in Monterey. And
Right.
They had an impromptu, they asked you to talk impromptu about your experience on the Parche. I don't know if everybody caught at the very beginning, Ben said he commanded the Parche, which is the most decorated ship in the US naval history, happens to be a submarine. But it was a classified briefing. It was just an incredible audience. The room was packed. What was really just so impressive was that I think you must have spoke for 40 minutes. I think there was a 2-hour line of people just waiting to shake hands and congratulate you and say a few kind words to you after the talk. That was very, very impressive.
Yeah. Oh, thank you.
Yeah.
I see some of these questions coming in. I'll try to take them on as they come. How threatening is the Chinese Navy? Formerly, not very much so at all. Today, significant, but it's the future that they're worried about. And we could say this about all Chinese military forces. They are leaping generations of technological development. We see this in mobile missiles. Chinese missiles used to be all liquid fueled. They used to be in silos only. Now they're solid fueled, supersonic, designed very much to go up against the United States. We see it in their aircraft. They used to fly early jet aircraft, F-8s that were sort of like Korean War vintage, and they went right over that to equivalent third, fourth generation US military aircraft. We see it in submarines. They had diesel boats that were glorified German U-boats that the Russians copied, they called them kilos, early generation. And then they went to with Russian help and also a lot of espionage from the United States. Yeah. They became very quiet. They became nuclear powered. They became air independent propulsion, and they're building them in large numbers. The Chinese Navy today is outbuilding the United States Navy 10-1. And they're expanding their shipyard capacity to build even more. The Chinese military strategy is the ring road belt strategy to extend their boundaries all the way up to the Arctic. And we could talk a long time about that, but I could also say that I worked for 2 years as the chief of staff to Jim Mattis, who was a Secretary of Defense. And I've spoken with him several times since. The defense policy guidance doesn't mention countries by name, but it is very clear to me that both the previous administration and what this administration has done so far recognizes China as the number one, the greatest threat to the American, not just military, but way of life. I got a question about China and Taiwan. I can have to be a little bit careful because this is an unclassified forum, but I played many war games involving a Chinese attack on Taiwan, and in every one of them, I wish I was on the Chinese side. They have a very short logistic supply chain. We have very long ones.
Yeah.
They pick the time. They have an enormous spy network already in place in country. Very difficult situation. It was hoped that the friction between China and Taiwan could be overcome through economic cooperation and development, because there is a lot of that. After the Hong Kong example, it's my personal opinion that that may not come to pass. And after Hong Kong gets completely taken over, Taiwan would appear to be next. And if you are into the military literature, last week, the Vice Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff publicly announced that as a result of a war game involving Taiwan, we need to completely change the way that we're fighting because we're too predictable and easy to defeat. And when we take our networks away from us, we fail. So it's a big issue.
Wow. Ben, there's a really interesting question. If I can ask you this
Yeah.
question. The question's about I think the next Fleet Forces Command is going to be under as for a former submariner. And to your earlier point about we really have three navies, can you just provide a comment on that in terms of how that might actually help bring more unity?
The Fleet Forces Commander is the senior operational commander of all ships in the Navy. The Navy is confusing because the senior admiral is called the Chief of Naval Operations, but he doesn't really operate any ships. He does control budgets. He does play a very important role in advising the President and the Secretary of Defense. He's a member of the Joint Chiefs. He makes a lot of personnel decisions and policy decisions, but he doesn't operate ships. This guy, the commander of Fleet Forces Command, is akin to the Air Force commander of Air Combat Command. They operate platforms worldwide. And he is a submariner. That's unusual. There have been some in the past. John Greenert was the last one. And they try to rotate them around. But traditionally, the Navy, through the first 20 years of a Navy officer's career, they do everything on submarines. And they don't work with carrier battle groups. And they don't ride on destroyers. And they learn those skills as they become more senior. But that's a challenge. So he's a fine guy and he'll do well. But he brings baggage into the job because he's a submariner. But that said, the submarine force is the number one priority of the Navy, and that is with surface and air admirals as well, and it remains so today.
I think there's one last question in the chat about leadership and culture in the Navy.
Leadership culture?
Yeah.
Well, you have the tribe issue. I'd say for a fact that we couldn't run the Navy today without females. And when I came into the Navy, I graduated from the Naval Academy in 1974. There were no females there, and it's a much better place with them. We couldn't run the Navy without them. There are issues. Well, in the 60s, we had race riots on large ships. There are issues with sexual harassment or worse. There are issues involving minorities in all the services. I'd like to think that we're getting better at that than we used to be, but those are areas where one infraction is one too many, and we'll probably always we're never going to achieve perfection there. We take people out of society. And that struck me when I was talking to some midshipmen out of the Naval Academy last year. They had one person in their company who had 5 honor violations. And when I was there, 1 honor violation and you were out.
Yep.
But
Yeah. Wow.
as has been shown at Harvard and other prestigious institutions, cheating and other kinds of things, plagiarism, doesn't have the same. Young people today are very talented. I'm not trying to throw anybody under the bus here, but they have different standards when it comes to those kinds of issues. And so they have to get well programs and whatever. And I think in that particular case, the 5th strike did result in dismissal. But
Well, thank you, Ben.
at the top, those are leadership issues. And I'm sorry for taking up more.
No, it's fascinating. Thank you, Ben. And
I'm on SMA email. Just shoot me one and I'll give you the best answer I can.
great. I think, Al, you had a question which we didn't get a chance to. Let's all stay seated. Well,
And we need, we need Ben to unmute though. Yeah, we go.
there we go.
I'm unmuted.
Yeah.
Okay, it's Al. Could you put me on the picture? Ben, did you see my,
Yes, Al.
His hat.
you see my hat?
Can we?
I don't.
There we go.
There we go.
There we go. Yeah. That's a fine ship.
It is
They
indeed.
cut it in half and made it 50 feet longer. It
Yep.
was made after Parche was decommissioned, which was cut in half and made 102 feet longer.
Incredible.
And to protect our kneecaps, neither you or I are going to tell them what they did with that extra section.
I think we'd be protecting more than just your kneecaps by not divulging that.
Thanks for indulging me. And of course, Ben, thanks for your service.
Thank you, Al.